Peter studied at Princeton before coming to the UK, and he's taught multiple levels, degree, master's and PhD for many, many years at Cambridge, and now he's leading the PhD at the London Metropolitan University. His research interests is to understand architectural and urban order, how they contribute to and are part of cultural conditions and possibilities. His talk tonight, one of the best titles I've heard in a long time, A Punkt in Spice. Please welcome Peter Carl.
Thanks very much. I don't know that we can compete with all the TV programs I see reviewed in The Guardian and so forth, but it was very interesting to hear Lauren's, because I grew up under Colin Rowe's formalism and have spent most of my life trying to get rid of it. And words like, I taught a whole year never using the word space, so there's an obvious kind of conversation there, I suppose. But at any rate, let's hope this works. Aim it at the computer, he tells me. Right. The problem I got interested in was the conversation that came up in the LSE discussion, which was between Bruno Latour and Graham Harman. And roughly, Bruno Latour was coming out of practice. They kept calling what he stood for empirical metaphysics. And Graham was coming out of something like the quadruple object. And when they get him, they labeled him as Heideggerian metaphysics, which of course is a term that Heidegger crosses legs over. And it occurred to me that while they kept rubbing each other's back, they were also not quite in tune with each other. And curiously, it was Bruno who kept coming up with things like Greek geometry, which too quickly got put into a formalism. But he did recognize that it came out of natural language. And he kept doing things like that, which Graham wasn't, which was curious to me. And I think there's an issue of language that has to do with how this kind of problem gets put together. Graham speaks in the quadruple object of a kind of extreme between proper philosophy and what he calls private ontologies on the internet. I mean, I don't do much internet, but I haven't found a private ontology on the internet. But I take his word for it. But what I'm interested in is how language has to adjust to what he calls objects. And it's a messy, more violent world than the world that he's trying to develop. And there is a whole host of problems built into it. Among them, the communication between primordial experiences of orientation or materiality and highly specialist discourses from engineering, from economics, so on and so forth. And particularly mixed discourses. And actually Graham's book has is a lot like that, where you find yourself going between really serious study to all of a sudden concepts like the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, or how wildly popular speculative realism is. And you constantly feel, well, I won't say constantly, but often you feel like he's trying to sell you something. And it's a very strange way to deal with this kind of problem. But it seems to me, an evening like this is very much this kind of issue. And, is there a common discourse? Is it something like, everyday language, or is that too loose? Or is it, something as precise as, information theory or something like that? Similarly, in collaboration, you're likely to find yourself working with people who are inept or even criminal, as well as people who are profound, really understand, creative and committed. That what Graham kept sort of trying to clarify the lumpy bits in Bruno's talk. And I began to wonder if, in fact, properly acknowledging the claim of what he calls objects, rather than to bring them all to a single horizon of language, wasn't something like the poetic language, which both Graham and Bruno faulted Heidegger over. That is to say, that it's in moving into this more concrete world that you begin to develop some sort of perspective on something like object. Speaking for myself, I would probably call myself, like Hannah Arendt, a sort of a phenomenologist. And the background that I come from, as I say, started off in Princeton, and I began working very closely with Dalibor Vesely at Cambridge. And we had a course, graduate course, called The Hissing Philosophy. We called it Of Architecture, so we could get it past the bureaucrats, but basically is in respect of architecture. And this is a typical kind of question that interests me. You know, there is this motif called humanist city that's been around since Schinkel and Klenze. And it's actually a 400-year process. It starts with civil warfare. And actually, by the time you get to all the stuff that most people think of as humanist city, you know, beautiful paintings, architecture, so on and so forth, you're really in its last kind of phases. Yet at the same time, it left a legacy for Europe that lasted really until the generation of Nietzsche. And the problem of this is, you know, basic data. The problem is understanding that, how to understand that kind of phenomenon. I found the quadruple object to be a mixture of real genuine insights, things I sort of partially agreed with and partially didn't, like you will with respect to my talk, or I did with respect to Lauren's. But one of the things that really shocked me was his representation of Heidegger's fourfold. He just lays it out flat, like four pancakes, and gives them labels and draws axes between them. And I go, where the hell are we now? It never occurred to me that you could do that. And he starts faulting it for things that I would never have faulted it for. So I'm saying to myself, why is he asking those questions? What neither Heidegger probably suppressed it, but for some reason Graham doesn't notice it either, is that it comes out of Plato. And it's actually a really important fragment. And it goes on to develop, I've underlined the words that relate to order, they all are variations on cosmos, that really are about how a city or polis lives, moves between, the fractious polis and cosmic conditions. And this business of geometrical equality, this is just not the kind of statement you find in contemporary philosophy. Yet to me, that in its sort of compact way, there is, that's the kind of register by which one should begin to think something like fourfold. Sorry, we can't seem to. Can we maybe turn off lights? Because you don't need to take notes. Go ahead and try it. There we go. That's better. This light, how do I turn it off? Anybody see the switch? That's the offending one. Right. However, one of his key statements towards the end is this: the basic rift in the cosmos lies between objects and relations in general. Everything plays out in the strife between concealed, by which he means real objects, and the twisted in his schema, and the twisted or translated forms which they appear to other objects. I'm definitely in the world of twisted and translated. That's where we're going to be spending the next sort of 20 minutes. One of the virtues of what he's up to, and he, like he does with many of the philosophers that he sort of drops in, reduces them to kind of slogans, though you can see from other things he's actually done quite a bit of homework and thought about them. But one of the people that he keeps seducing, sort of in the background, is Empedocles, who he presents as having come up with the 4 elements and love and hate, and then he goes on. In fact, what that was, and what you can't see here, is a circle with, a square inside it, that he's dealing with a world of the 4 temperaments. And this was how you not only understood nature, but how nature communicated with almost everything that was going on in, given reality for about 3,000 years. And in fact, they're still trying to recover something like it in Naturphilosophy of the late 18th, early 19th century. And even if you have to shift to Rêverie, as he calls it, Bachelard is, of course, trying to recover this sense of a world that communicates. The 4 elements have nothing to do with elements as we understand them. I mean, I could tell you what, if you're interested in this, there's a very nice little book by a guy named Spike Bucklow called The Alchemy of Paint that does a very good job on this whole tradition. But it affects medicine, it affects painting, it affects, how you make things, how you understand health. And you can see bits of it, obviously, in Vitruvius and his Windrose City. But he seems to be trying to, in order to get over subject-object or the human world or culture-nature, which is the thing he faults Heidegger for, culture-nature, this is part of a general movement. I mean, there's definitely something to this. Whether you get to call everything object and relations as a result, I'm less convinced of. This comes from Bruno's last book, and I would say what we're really talking about is morals and phenomena, because one of the key things of phenomenology is that you don't have facts, you have phenomena. They exist in their context. It doesn't tell you what to think. All it asks is that you understand how they're situated in the world, to cut a long story short. But it's in that domain that I would distinguish between morals and ethics. I think what architects do is mostly like morals. That's very concrete, very particular. There's judgments being made in very concrete circumstances. Whereas ethics is more like the philosophy of the good. There is, unlike the theories of social justice, which try to get from, a hypothesis of goodness from the lowest common denominator or whatever else, somebody like Rawls, sorry, that's a bad version of Rawls, but now I'm into slogans, to actually, a way to treat fishermen in the Bronx or something like that. I just don't think that's possible. It's a dialect. There are definitely 2 different levels of reflection. That I'm obviously getting out of Gadamer, his 3 essays on practice and obviously truth and method. To me, I'm less concerned with the hammer and nearness and onmost and deseverance and a whole series of themes that Graham, as I say, sort of partially agrees with what I have to think, and or I just partially agree with what he has to think. My main interest in that is how it illuminates world. It has a very simple starting point in Aristotle, that you only have access to the universal through the particular. It's part of finitude, and I don't know whether Melissu's piece on finitude interests you or not. I'm less interested in that than I am in his piece on Mallarmé's coup de dé, but that's another day. What is much more interesting to me is the unready to hand. This is the man himself from the Markowitz series, and he has in his hand this very prominent pen. And you can't see it probably, but that is the pen there. Markowitz probably said, "Pretend you're thinking, Professor Heidegger, and I'll take a picture." I'm now going to take this pen away. with luck. Nope, not yet. There we go. That little white bit was the pen. Once the pen's gone, the rest of the office is paralyzed. He cannot no longer think or write, and he's caught up in that. It's not like all of its equipment in some way. And if we, the view is gone, the books are dead, so on and so forth. And if we do the reverse and just have the pen, we realize we're in a very different game. I don't know whether this is a real object, it's a slide of a real object or a sensual object, but it could be mightier than the sword, it could be a stylus, it could be a marital aid. I mean, it can go anywhere. It kind of looks like a product on the internet, possibly. But what that unreadiness to hand shows you is a structure of dependencies. That is to say, they aren't just, and Graham just piles up the objects in the office, they aren't piled up, they depend on each other. The pen depends, the fluidity of the pen, its capacity to write, think, depends on the paper, which depends on that great oak desk, which is probably a bit of an altar and a bit of a tomb for Heidegger, but we can go into that another day. Which depends on the books on the walls in the four-quartered house. As you know, the office faces east. It's the only window. The office is next to the bedroom, so philosophy next to dreaming, and the other two parts of the house are domestic, with a hearth in the center, with this view to nature, and in fact that the water in which the fountain falls comes from an old form of coffin from the Black Forest. What we're beginning to hint at is something like the horizons for thinking, writing, and the access to world, which has dropped off the end of the slide, but believe me, the word is there. Maybe that's the point. Oh, it's gone over there. We obviously have a different layout. It is also a structure dependency of times. One's thought goes in all sorts of directions. I mean, some of you are listening to me, some of you are wondering if you fed the cat, so on and so forth. Your posture and gestures move more slowly. The furniture moves more slowly still, and slowest of all are the, floor and walls. That structure, as I say, is a kind of access to world. You only have it through the particular, but it is your access to it. Right, now what I want to do is go through this business of how object and world communicate with each other, and I'm going to give a slightly different reading than Lorenz gave. I'm going to use a passage from Finnegan's Wake, which I admit is deeply pretentious, but I can assure you that I know, this is about the only part of Finnegan's Wake that I know in this level of detail. I do recommend it. It is hilarious. At any rate, so past times are past times. Now let bygones be bygones. That is by or near. Guns is a pub, but it's also begun. This is a Danish phrase that's, it's like that in this beautiful world, my children. This is also Danish for wild, and it will need otherwise, since primal made alter, primal obviously being first, but also some primal creator figure, made a change, but also made an alter, is also second, so first and second, in the Garden of Eden, the same, obviously Eden. So we have some play with the Garden of Eden. The tass above is a flask below, says the Emerald Canticle of Hermes. For those of you who are familiar with alchemy, this is daily bread. This is the touchstone for all sort of alchemical speculation, that there is this relation between what's on earth and what's above. It's the second of 10 precepts. and all's loath and pleased stir. Loath is also love and pleasure, but we're now recalling Empedocles and Aristotle. It's love and loathe, as well as loath, a will, and pleased stir as the way the temperaments mix with each other and actually doing a bit of alchemy, if you like. We are told on excellent ink bottle authority, where the ink bottle and the flasks begin to communicate, i.e. the writing is a form of alchemy, as it were. So we're systematized. So now what we're doing is we're saying, having just said the task above is like the flask below, we're now looking at what above is. And we're now into post-Einsteinian relativism. This is written by a guy named Dunn, this serial universe, and it's basically a motif of, it's an interpretation of temporality that was very popular at the time. He was an Irish aeronautical engineer. I think that's the main reason he got in here. But it's also serial-comic. In a more and more almighty expanding universe, that's the title of a book by Eddington, who's the guy who proved relativity through an experiment involving an eclipse of the sun. Under one, there is rhymeless reason, obviously playing with rhyme or reason as poetry and logic, but rhymeless reason because it is rendered in mathematics. To believe original sun, original sin, and original son with a capital S, as in Christ. And this was something that Augustine put down the Donatists with, this is the Latin, and the verdict of the world is conclusive, i.e. the Donatics were regarded heretics by the Orthodox Catholic Church. And this is a mixture of Latin and Greek. It means not at all certainly, therefore. So it's Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker who's the lead figure in this thing. But this is Estonian also for grave, a grave. But oh, for this culpability, felix culpa, i.e. that the happy sin that allows me to be saved. Sweet bad cesti was a kind of curse for an archetype or an architect. And the hearsay and paradox lust you can deal with yourselves. And there's a footnote attached to this sequence. We don't hear the booming cursowaries, i.e. a war, a battle, curse, and war, obviously coming from cassowaries, these big birds. We won't fear the fleshes of fighting. Flesh is French for arrow, but it's also flashes of lightning. We float the Mediterranean and come back to the isle we love in spice, Punkt. And what Punkt is the place where ancient Egypt went to get spices. And there's a very famous set of reliefs in the Hatshepsut tomb showing that. But what the spice islands are, and the spices were obviously used for embalming and so on and so forth, but what the spice islands are outhouses in Irish slang. Now that would seem to be perhaps a ruddy mess. Let's presume we can put it. But what we basically have is three creation stories, one involving Eden. This is a 1618 Marian engraving trying to turn the emerald tablet into a scene. And I'm not going to go into it in detail. And that is obviously the Big Bang, which they didn't call it at the time that Joyce was writing, but it's basically that phenomenon, and obviously represented at any rate. And this is a segment of the relief. This is the departure from Punkt before the return, and that's obviously an outhouse. So we have two creation stories and one kind of journey that results in, shall we just call it a transformation. However, if we just organize it thematically with the outhouse here, Punkt here, the creation of Eden, alchemy, and creation according to astrophysics, i.e. what's above might be described by Einstein rather than by the whole tradition of Empedocles, and there's a kind of conflict in there. We can see what I've done is I've just set them. There's a key moment here where there's a process involved. So it's peristalsis, embalming, symbolic in chemistry, the Big Bang, and a kind of result. And of course the result, the sound Punkt, is the sound of a turd hitting the ground. And it's also a Punkt in spice, therefore. But it's also the prima materia of the alchemists. And you can deal with original sins, but if we stratify these, i.e. if we turn these kind of this way, there's a kind of bodily condition that communicates with a series of speculative levels. That is what I've called mystery, myth, history, Christian theology, what I just call traditional science, and modern science. Now, the text itself is a kind of stream of consciousness, and while it's a remarkable and very difficult text, it's actually, in my view, much more accurate to the nature of our involvement in the world than many of other kinds of texts that presume to flatten it all to that single horizon. The language gains a kind of thickness. It doesn't become transparent. It's something that you find yourself working with. The words are like objects and multiple objects. Why Graham doesn't like the word thing, which is what Heidegger uses, and prefers object, may in fact have to do with a latent desire to preserve the subject. But at any rate, but all this drama defers to the topics within what we might call, at the loosest term for the moment, an analogical field. One of the reasons this comes up is that as a result of the claims from logic in the post-Enlightenment scene, Romanticism found itself in poesy, which was, claims from nature, from drama, from art, poetry particularly, with all the forms of analogy but logic, as it were. And of course, they then went, through motifs like aesthetics, tried to turn them into concepts. But that, as a result, this business of a split between the sciences and humanities, which you can probably first notice about the time of Galileo, and is the kind of thing that architects struggle with day in, day out, and is the kind of thing all these characters seem to be trying to overcome, for which they have my utter sympathy and support, is part of why one starts working back into the language and trying to understand what kind of horizons are invoked and how. And what I'm suggesting by this preliminary stratification is that that's is that a focus problem? At any rate, what I propose to do in 3 slides is give a kind of counter account and then finish off with more Le Corbusier and another altar. I decided what I was involved with, particularly when I got to London Met, and we were tasked with the problem of PhD by practice. And the claim from practice was that, look, this is communicable, what are we talking about? I said, this is actually right on the money. This is an interesting problem. And so I called the framework for our course practical wisdom. I didn't want to call it ontology, and I certainly didn't want to call it a theory. But precisely why Aristotle stratifies kinds of knowing in the Nicomachean Ethics, from techne, great big rupture, to phronesis, to episteme, to Sophia, is that Sophia kind of orients the rest of that world. And among the things I was concerned to include was that in the context of university, this word interdisciplinary was like being pucker. And most of the way people understood interdisciplinary was by bringing it all to a kind of single epistemological horizon. through method. And I think Latour is absolutely spot on when he says that in chemistry, you just do chemistry. In the social sciences, they agonize over epistemology. There's no science that exists that is anything like the social sciences. And I think he's dead right. But at any rate, what I realized in architecture was that you had this way of moving between primordial experiences of spatiality or materiality and very sophisticated discourses. And I mean, this is a diagram I drew up years ago, trying to work out, I mean, for some second-year students, the different levels of understanding that move through, you know, being an architect, where ideas go, what constitutes an idea, what's the role of the office, you know, what's the role of something like BIM, you know, blah. I also wanted to include scope for partial understanding, since that seemed to be the general horizon of communication that was possible. And I wanted to particularly to include the scope for what we'll call here the spatial manual material intelligence, i.e. this seemed to me to be what in the word thought in Heidegger is one of these things like sucking your breath and like this is where it's really happening. And I think it's a deeper problem than that. I think thought is part of a continuum. This word tact comes from Gadamer, from Helmholtz, and it's part of the practical imagination. That is to say, when you're making a chair, you first of all have to worry about what kind of level of decorum the chair is. You know, is this just something to plunk your ass on, or is this, you know, for the queen, or is this a toilet seat, or is it a stool? Then you start getting involved in making it, and there's resistance that comes from, you know, you have to do a different kind of chair if you're working in wood than if you're working in plastic, i.e. the business of doing that well is a kind of tact. And it was an interesting, it all of a sudden got a quasi-moral issue right in the middle of where I wanted it to be, because this question of what's good design is at some level ultimately a moral or perhaps even an ethical question. So 3 slides. This image on the left is the final scene from the Eumenides, the third part of the Oresteia. And because we're going to run out of time, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but what has basically happened is the first part of the trilogy, I really hate hearing myself. If you lose it, I'm sorry. The first part of the trilogy is all governed by the retributive justice of Zeus, i.e. revenge. And what happens in the Eumenides is that Orestes finds himself first of all in Delphi, where the Furies are still chasing him, and Apollo turns up and says, look, you've got to go to Athens and be judged with Athena in attendance. And he's judged by the archons on the Areopagus. No, I've collapsed. Don't worry about the 2 triangles for a minute, but just remember they're there, because we'll come to them in 2 seconds. And what happens is the retributive justice of Zeus turns into the civic justice managed by the archons, who incidentally have just been assigned the task by Ephialtes about 3 years earlier of being the judges of murder trials. The agora is off to your left. That's obviously the Acropolis in the background. And I've intentionally made it anachronistic. The time of the play rather than the time in the play, which is basically Mycenaean. And I use that scene as a kind of primordial scene that enables me to say several things. First of all, this business of individual thought that keeps coming out of and individual involvements that keeps coming out of the Heidegger seems to me one should say it's all about being with people and things, that one is always part of that. So the first phrase in red is the inversion or the cancellation of Descartes, cogito ergo sum. Now, at this stage of the thing, we're in a kind of analogical field where it's possible for things to have relatedness, and Grassi, citing Bruni, makes the observation that the businessman is like the poet in being able to find unusual relationships. By the poet, he means the master of metaphor, which from Aristotle to Kant can't be taught. Secondly, this kind of order is constituted out of distances, agonic distances, i.e. I'm always involved with something that's not me. I mean, even looking in the mirror, I am strange to myself, or even thinking about myself, I have become strange to myself. And that other thing or person has a claim. What happens, happens between us. So that the business of difference is where all the creativity comes from. Secondly, how they're oriented, or thirdly, how they're oriented is through the topic. And that's one of the reasons that I arranged the Joyce in terms of topics. I.e., a conversation or my involvement with that microphone or whatever is a kind of co-creation of understanding. We're both involved, as I say, what happens between us. And it's inevitably partial. You never sort of come to absolute agreement or reach truth. It's always on the way, as the famous man once said. Fourthly, it's always involved in a kind of situation, a topic. In this case, this is poor Orestes trying to defend himself to the judges, and I've left Apollo and Athena invisible, rather than indulge in neoclassical or Renaissance painting trying to, figure out what Athena looked like. Though she did cast the deciding vote. That is to say, things are always involved in terms of the situation. Even atoms, the only place you find spare atoms is in physics textbooks. Otherwise, they're doing their job. That this analogical field gains orientation through the topic in accordance with institutional horizons, as I call them. Now, I'd say there's three kinds of institution. One is the official institution, like, Parliament or a wedding or the post office or something like that. Second is more unofficial, the kind of latent public or ephemeral public that Dewey talks about in The Public and Its Problems, i.e. emergency situations, the four guys who meet at the corner of the piazza every day, your Facebook friends, something like that. And then more primordially, on which the other two depend, are things like customs, language, and that's obviously a very rich world, and that's all I'm going to say about that for the moment. But there's two characteristics about institutions that seem to me important. One, they speak to what is common to all. There's a kind of ultimate level of anonymity, and that's incredibly valuable in anything relating to morals or ethics. Secondly, institutions come with constituencies. Even something as abstract as the isosceles triangle, you can just use it for your whole life and never have heard of Euclid or Riemann or anything else. But as soon as you do become more involved with it, you immediately invoke that whole series of people and the traditions that go along with it, how you discuss it. I mean, I just can't show up in a mathematical discussion and say anything anybody would care about because I can't speak their language. This is the ontic world that Heidegger talks about. But I would suggest that for practice, which is always in the particular world, institution gives being its character and orientation. Or it gives the topic orientation with respect to being, gives it a kind of direction. That is to say, the most primordial level of this is a kind of orientation within being. I don't think it's possible to step out of being, outside of being. It's impossible to objectify. And one of the ambiguous things about the Harman exercise is that he's trying to undo being. I don't know why. He's also very worried about the degrees of overlap he has with things like pragmatism or Wittgenstein. There's a kind of philosophic bookkeeping that I'm less worried about. it doesn't surprise me that people overlap and have similar things to say, but also they're similar and different. But this, you know, when Heidegger got asked to speak about dwelling to a conference that was supposedly organized to rebuild post-war Germany, and he, you know, did the poetics of dwelling, and you get this metaphor of language as a house of being. Whether language, which comes first or second, you know, you can go around the circle, but that motif of dwelling is something that I would put prior to any formal discussion about, you know, column arrangements or frontalities or any of that sort of thing. One of the interesting things that happens in the Oresteia is that the set stays the same but keeps changing. And that's a fundamental characteristic of place, and particularly of a particular kind of commonplace that was cultivated in the polis. And I've given several examples along the bottom. In fact, what's called a helaya there has now been downgraded to a warehouse, but it's a sufficient diagram of what a helaya, which is the law court, amounts to. That is to say, it's characterized by this, you know, pro and contra, the common ground of difference, and a kind of horizon. That is to say, the game that one plays with topos and topic, and commonplace as it's meant in the topics by Aristotle, which are, you know, statements that come up again and again that are never resolvable, but are very characteristic, very typical of being human. What has happened here is that they have institutionalized conflict as the way in which democracy will find, you know, as good a truth as it can. It's obviously implicated in Earth World in the sense that Heidegger uses it, and I'll come back to that briefly in a second. And Heidegger is notorious for not really discussing cities, although he does have, and I don't think the meditations on Holderlin's Hymn to the Ister will do the job, but that seems to be the world from which a lot of the late texts came after the war. But he does have this wonderfully provocative phrase, and Graham cites all the stuff that comes before it, but not this phrase. That the city gives a definite direction to nature. That is to say, it just completely effaces the culture, nature, you know, artificial, natural sort of distinctions. And it is about this motif of direction, which we can perhaps come back to. Right, you can't see a fucking thing there. Fortunately, I have the cartoon version. The second layer of this is something that Dalibor deserves real credit for introducing Merleau-Ponty as an expansion of ready-to-hand or unready-to-hand. And both he and Merleau-Ponty speak of stratification, of levels, and so forth. But what I did was I went into the phenomenology of perception and tried to actually document those levels. And this is going to be published shortly, so you can read it then. But the cartoon version, I was worried about that because it's just such a lot of little text. The cartoon version you've perhaps seen before, where one speaks about the topic and different kinds of levels of involvement. Key word. I've gotten rid of perception of, precisely because I don't want to have subjects and objects anymore, and rephrased it as involvement with, i.e. it's the thing that happens between. And Tao will take me to task on that. But these, the more concrete levels are in dialogue with the more articulate levels. And if we had more time, I would argue that these are always collective, whereas these are how the individual moves up and down this. Dalibor speaks of ontological movement in respect of this transaction. And I would say, you can't, I don't know if you can read that. I would say that the upper and lower bounds of this move between possibilities and conditions, which is a bit like the old necessity and freedom, between Dalibor's terms, embodiment and articulation, or the Heideggerian earth and world, or Da and Sein, if you like. And that there is always a bit of that down here, and there's always a bit of that, even in the most abstract speculations. I divide symbol and concept on the grounds that symbol is vertical, concept is horizontal. Concept deals with what is most general, universal deals with, something like the good. Oh, the other little bit to point out, I'm one of those people who doesn't believe there's really a present, or at least for understanding, that understanding is a constant transaction between recollection and anticipation. Okay, the last part of this is temporality, and I'm only interested in one aspect of it. The phenomenon of time out of time, which has its roots in ritual, is then reinterpreted as actor-spectator in tragic drama, or comic drama, and that itself is reinterpreted. I mean, I've called these times, it's probably not the best word, but it's quick, in philosophic contemplation. And in all of these, it involves an agon that is kind of reinterpreted at different levels of removal. Clifford Geertz, in his famous book on Nagara, made the observation that perhaps the civic ritual is the purpose of the town. And that was an interesting insight, because that, to me, on this, is no different from what Aristotle says is the purpose of the town, which is the bios theoretikos, i.e. profound understanding. And that's an interesting aspect of the modalities of participation in that phenomenon. What's also interesting, the distinction that everybody makes from it since Aristotle between poetry being more true than history, is that those civic institutions that I pointed out, that are built out of the official recognition of pro and contra, i.e. part of rhetoric, is that I recognize your position and then give mine and vice versa, is that it's not the time out of time that allows one to be in the presence of what is true or deep, or a drama regarding renewal or rebirth or whatever, but it's got a kind of structure to it that is similar to that, and is obviously more open to historical accident, i.e. it's kind of basic ceremony, it's more of a ceremony than a ritual. But the play between them seems to me quite a significant insight into how we think and be, as it were. And so if I had to diagram Heidegger's fourfold, it would look something like this, in which this is the topic between these two possibilities. And I probably don't even need the word symbolic to distinguish from practical, because I think they're a bit like those two triangles. They're always there. And these I would represent as, institutional horizons at the different levels of participation or involvement. And I've inscribed that in the crossed being, which is where the simultaneous combination of the fourfold and the forgetting revealing of being, which is part of being finite. And my little graham cracker there is meant to represent kind of earth. But for somebody like Plato, the gods are also in the earth, not simply in the sky. But it's a much more dynamic kind of vision of what fourfold might be, and the kind of, you can see the potential in it for being, as it were, stupid or profound or arrogant, and how they might begin to communicate with each other. And so finally, I want to look at one corner of this in these terms. This is obviously Ronchamp, and I've put it here because these projects were started at the same time. And it represents a real tension in architecture, where on the one hand, there's, you know, the statistical capitalism generates these vast abstractions that are, you know, people storage for processing information or for shopping or whatever else. And on the other hand, we have these small things that are still the sort of scale of, I don't know, a Renaissance town that we can do quite well as architects. And they have this kind of primitive character that's meant to be a kind of resistance to these. It's clear that these guys were inspired by this because that window came from that window, except that it's big enough for the whole fucking building. And that's the kind of, you know, partial understanding that you run across. When Corb presented this building to the archbishops and theologians, he declared to them, he only spoke for about 2 minutes, he declared to them, some things are sacred, some things are not, whether or not they're religious, as if they needed instructing. What it suggests is that there's something interesting going on with the building. And I'm only going to look at this corner. Clearly, the similarity between these is perhaps conscious, perhaps unconscious. This is 26 years earlier than this. But the similarity between the altar and the drawing table suggests we're in a world that's not unfamiliar now that we've looked at the joists, between something that is meant to have a kind of paradigmatic existence and something that may be more typical. What interests me, as I say, is this corner. What you have here in the Ozefon studio is a stair, and this is a library with a little, tiny little window in it that's, you know, a kind of celestial cave, rising over a hearth. And it hits a horizon. Still there, opposite it, is a reservoir with a level of water. And in the back of both these buildings is all a world of shadow and ambiguity, or both these rooms. Clearly, this room is made for the altar, as Lawrence was saying. And this is before he moved the cross over here. Both photographs are incidentally Le Corbusier's. And we have this similar ascent to a kind of horizon. This one for music, this for words. The underside of that is painted gold. Now, again, I'm just marking these. What seems to be the case, this is the inside of the chapel that's here, that in the daytime gets sunlight and there's this warm red glow that comes out of there that I suggest is reminiscent of that fireplace or hearth or foyer, as Le Corbusier made the center of his houses. The key to that little sequence comes out of a painting he did in the late 20s called The Lines of the Hand. And that is actually red, though it doesn't look it. It's not bright red like that, it's a darker red. And what you have is a hearth that's rendered in the same world of planes as this, which is a motif that he discovered in 1929, where you take a matchbox apart, cut out the bottom of the drawer, unfold the sleeve, and mount it on top. And this is how he draws it in the poem De l'Envoi. What you have is a world of perspectival shadow underneath a world of frontal luminous clarity, perhaps with an oculus. And it's the dialogue between them, it's obviously the same thing unfolded, as it were, is circle and ellipse, or sun and water. And so that figure sits on the top of the altar. The fire is this hand, which has all these chiromantic, I got this coincidentally from a 17th century book written by a guy named Corvus, which means crow, which is also what Corbeau means, or Corbeau. With his right angle on it and so forth. And this thing is a kind of epiphany. This seems to be both smoke and the bark, the wood of which it's burned, perhaps also the famous mysterious alchemical text that Flamel brought back from Spain that was printed on bark. And, oh, you can't see this for shit, all right. Savina then did a sculpture based on this, which Le Corbusier called the Cathedral. This, I've never done that before, that's interesting. This hand is both the fire and the hand. As the hand, it's obviously the hand that you see in Le Corbusier's images all the time, the hand that makes. But in Gargantua and Pantagruel, which Corb read assiduously, it's also a Pythagorean 5, a sign of marriage, therefore fusion of opposites. And we've got something certainly moving in the esoteric world that he's inherited from late symbolist tradition, and I'm not going to go on about that. But in the sculpture, that thing has been simplified to a shape like that, which you're just going to have to take my word for it because it is downright invisible, is exactly the corner that we're talking about, in plan at least. And as much as it's dedicated to Mary, whose fecundation by the Holy Ghost is often symbolized by light, as you see it here in the 17th century image, and in the famous Van Eyck, that would be east, so the light's coming from the north. It also produces this curious, there's a whole series of things that are said, but at the beginning of one of her services for the festival of her Ascension, it creates this cross, like you see on the door underneath the roof cloud, right at the center line of the church. Whereas in the evening, this again is Corb's full-page image. The sun is now in the west, and it casts this bull shadow. And this painting called Pacify is explicitly dated to Pentecost, and it seems to be a kind of section through Ronchamp, that being the window in question. Sorry, why have we suddenly decided we're not going to move? No, we're in a world that was first imagined by Appia about the time that Schwarzkopf was beginning to develop the notion of space, which everybody flew with for the rest of the 20th century. That is to say, it's a world that mixes matter and light. And the reason I dislike form and space is because they're utter generalizations. They're like the gray things you see in your CAD screen. Everything has to be supplied. You know, you get this thing that's shaped like this with kind of texture on it. You don't know whether you're dealing with a bollard, another marital aid, or, you know, a skyscraper for Sheikh Zayed Road. But that also seemed to be full of potential, and of course it is. It's utterly promiscuous. It can, as Lawrence rightly said, it's everything and nothing. But for somebody like Le Corbusier, who, in his curious and actually quite interesting way, which I'm again not going to go into, trying to, but that whole generation was interested in things like myth, i.e., if everything becomes fragments after the kind of generation of Nietzsche, this generation is trying to work in dialogue with the new possibilities and the received order. And part of what Le Corbusier is involved with is these kinds of, people call them myths. I'll live with that for this evening. But this is a key image. If ever you've been on the north shore of Brittany, you've seen this kind of thing. He calls it, this is slipped. It's meant to be here on your land of dreams. He calls it both a land of dreams and a geometric phenomenon, i.e. complete opposites. He draws himself as an archipelago in the bath. And that is a key to Le Corbusier's spatial ordering. It's this, you know, from the outside, Ronchamp looks like a completely arbitrary piece of sculpture. From the inside, it's got a real dignity. This business of a world that's coming apart or is, as it were, fixed geometrically, and you can do it 2D or 3D if you like, is the kind of ambivalent world that makes objects out of things like the pulpits, the altar, the window, against walls that seem like pieces of the sky, even if they're a cave. And that business of that edge of the sea where the tide comes in and out, and it's very ambivalent, is part of his dialectics of water, which, if you know his river of history, there's a kind of element of depth and deep ambiguity, and yet at the same time it's this resolute horizon that of course follows you as you go up and down its individual and the kind of cosmic theater, and I'm not going to go into that, but in the poem there is this figure. I think it comes out of the phanes of the Orphic hymns. Orpheus, Prometheus, and Dionysus were probably the three most important Greek gods to 20th century Paris, and how they got so wrapped around bulls, I really don't know, but they did, and certainly Le Corbusier did. But you've got a kind of natural horizon and a kind of, I don't know, metaphysical or spiritual horizon, and this configuration, you see it even appears in a very innocent way, that's both male and female, Corb himself, you know, bull's nostrils or breasts. Now this, in Harman's terms, is a unicorn or Popeye. I believe that it's part of the configuration of Longchamp. Certainly this is when the bull began to migrate from the paintings. He's actually very laconic. I mean, he really keeps the paintings as kind of emblematic research. But it's one of the motifs that becomes very specifically iconographic in his buildings at this period. Right. Architecture is a discipline of peripheral vision, therefore of contexts, of the conditions for praxis or horizons for praxis. And it's on that ground that it's congenial to phenomenological hermeneutics. It's basically a problem of mediation between the fundamental conditions and, you know, what can be enacted in history. And if we look at Longchamp as this kind of time out of time, I've made two columns of institutional horizons and topics. At the very basic level, it's the world of decorum. This is people go quiet inside that building, or mostly. I ran into a German tour, but never mind. And ways of treating things, iconography, potential symbolism, potential meaning. What you keep really quiet about, what you allow to be latent. Within the official institution that you have there, of church or Greek myth in terms of the play between the Minotaur and Christ and pacifying Mary and night and day, within the more universal framework, what he would call the sacred, of life praxis within the sea, you're always in the lower part of the matchbox with the clear life, under the horizon. That's the height of the doors. And the horizon itself is marked by, words in harmony, where the possibility of understanding, the possibility of a deeper level of understanding can take place in a world of coincidentia positorum within dissolution and constitution. So, if to really do my own sloganing, if I have to boil this down, I would say, while both Graham and Bruno are working with similar themes, I find myself at home in bits of both. I certainly, I think Bruno is better on what an actor is than, network is one of those words that, is absolutely flat ontology to me. I just do not go with network. And he has this concept called plasma, which he represents in the discussion at the LSE as, imagine the diagram of an underground network. Everything else is plasma. That whole, that is absolute flat ontology to me. The archetype of which, of course, is the res extensa. And that's part of the problem of being French, I think. But to me, there is the issue is one of depth. And it may be that Graham's objects are sort of going on underneath all the stuff that matters to me, sort of like the 6 hidden dimensions of so-called quantum foam, that's, matter, energy, space-time, or ever since Shannon managed to make information look like Boltzmann's notion of entropy, perhaps just pure information. But I have a way of registering that and, living in the world, as it were. And I would say that that this phenomenon of depth not only accounts for the different kinds of involvement between objects or between things and people, in my terms or Heidegger's terms, but that this depth allows this to begin to communicate with something like morals, which is what Bruno's struggling with in the philosophy of nature or politics of nature. Sorry, thanks very much.
So I think we probably have time for some questions.
Yes.
Any questions?
Yes.
While you're all warming up, I'll kick us off with a question. Peter, if I read you rightly, if I understand you correctly, Joyce's approach to interpretation and also Le Corbusier's in all of the backup material and paintings around Ronchamp are a kind of representation of what you're describing as the kind of truer description of involvement in the world. So that sort of sets up a question in my mind as to when we're architects designing, there seems to be different levels. On the one hand, we're just involved in the world in that kind of rich way. On the other hand, we could be like Joyce and Le Corbusier, and we could represent it and work with it in representations in our architecture. But also, like you were saying, maybe Harman's objects are going on underneath in the background. If we take the altar which appeared throughout, if we assume the architect is designing the altar, so they could
modular specification.
Yeah, they could be doing they could have all the paintings going on in the background. They could be thinking about involvement. They could be being involved, but they could also be handling the realism in a kind of scientific sense, dealing with the weight of a block of stone or the dimensions to get it through a doorway. Or possibly, and here's me interpreting a bit of how Harman's realism might be a bit different from science, possibly architects might just be handling the question of the alternate purposes of that altar. That there might be a kind of sense when you're an architect designing that there is, as Lauren sort of suggested, a contingency, and maybe a radical contingency, to the way our socio-symbolic sphere is constructed. And architects might continually work with the sense that altar could be in the church, but also that altar could be discovered 1,000 years later and made into a lintel of a farmhouse, or it could be slept on by someone sleeping in the church overnight. And maybe if I'm trying to help out with Harman's realism, so there's 4 there that I'm wondering. So what do you think there is any place for the latter options, the scientific options of handling the weight?
I certainly think that's an incomplete task, and I think, every physicist will tell you, they don't really have a grasp on what gravity is, for example. There used to be this wonderful installation in the Science Museum that was kind of the edge of a pond, and there was a tree, and kind of was a whole cycle of animals, each eating each other, and would go around like this, and it was this kind of cycle of life. And I think there's one description of that's kind of, ecological niche that you could probably decant, as many people have, into market theory. You could also see it as justice or something like that. And I don't think science will ever get that far, though it did look more like that under the Empedocles Aristotelian world. And I think the degree to which these characters are saying what we presently have, what Bruno keeps calling the epistemology police, is inadequate for tasks that we face and that are necessary. With that, I agree. But Latour's world, I mean, it's interesting that Graham says, I used to be a Heideggerian, now I'm a Latourian, and I expect I have to read his most recent book to find out what that means, but I haven't. Why I like words like direction or modes of involvement is that I think it is incredibly rare to find complete agreement on anything or complete disagreement. And I have absolutely no problem. I mean, there's Monreale Cathedral, there's documents from the 12th century that talk about it being used as a brothel, ditto St. Paul's. So the idea that the altar can get reused, I think it takes, most of the people who visit Longchamp now, all of the original generation, those photographs, they're all dying off, and most of the visitors there are architects, and they sort of go see space and form, I suppose. And so the capacity for misreading, for recycling, for double meanings, all of that's possible, but I don't see, it seems to me it's a requirement of anything called an ontology not to be utterly destroyed by that that's actually part of the way reality works most of the time. And that's why I'm very, very reluctant to get into, schemes of schemes. I mean, the thing about the Cullen Rowe is that, you talk to Cullen, for those of you who don't know, I worked with him briefly on, until we fell out, on a project for a design for the Rome Interrota thing. And Colin was doing all his figure field stuff with this fat pen and went through a whole roll of tracing paper in an afternoon. And it was like, a combination of Baedeker and Goethe. He's just making up all these. He knew everybody who was, particularly of royalty, who lived in the 19th century. He was absolutely determined to make it. It never occurred to me. We're going to make it. He came up to this scenario that the Roi de Rome had moved to the Palatine Palace. And so he's going around the area and telling stories about, Principessa Rospigliosi being eyed by, a guy standing by a well down in the piazza, and meanwhile her real lover is kind of sneaking in behind, and there's a palace crisis, and he's got places for all this. There's like playing house or something. There's a completely different world. Then of course, once he got it, it began to be fields and twisted fields and so on and so forth, and by which time it had ceased to be, either Rome or his Rome. And so I'm very wary of these games or words that overgeneralize. If there's one, if I were to write a book like his, I would call it the concrete, which isn't the same as tactility, which is what everybody does when you mention the word concrete. Concrete, lives in this world of associations, and they aren't completely random. One of the interesting things about surrealist objective chance is what objective might mean. It means it can be shared as a minimum. And yet it's still, got this enigmatic quality that, it's kind of like killing a joke. You can over-describe it. You get its direction. You get what's at stake. You get what's kind of important or unimportant. And that is about as good as we can do, in my view.
Any more questions, other than my own?
Although you've been at pains from the start to declare your progress away from Colin Rowe, I'd like to draw back to his explorations of transparency, because repeatedly your superimposition of diagrams and the illustrations through Corbusier's drawings involve some kind, and indeed even the James Joyce quotation, involve a multiplicity of layerings or of overcastings which are transparent to each other, and you see one thing through another. So that it seems to me that whether one is talking about literal or phenomenal transparency, all of these symbolical possibilities that you've explored seem to depend on a model of simultaneity and transparency which relate to cubism. In the sense that one might say that it's become our symbolic equivalent to perspective as symbolic form in the Renaissance. And so there is a kind of formalistic matrix behind a lot of what you're saying.
The question of why the formalism is so interesting is definitely an interesting problem. One of the things you notice, to go back to a kind of root of it, and maybe this will be good enough and maybe it won't. One of the things about ritual is that it's inevitably keyed to rhythm. The spatial conditions, the language, your postures, your hymns and song, and it's one of the characteristics of time out of time, as it were, is this kind of rhythmic world that has its own sort of autonomy that allows, at the same time, it's a bit like what Aristotle says of tragic drama, that it's a mimesis of praxis, i.e. it's propitiating, it's praising, it's gift-giving, it's asking if it'll rain or something, but you don't just go to a kind of celestial tap. There's a whole lot you have to go through before that conversation becomes plausible. It's also very compact. And I think this motif of palimpsest, of layers, and actually I don't think, the reason that layers matters to transparency, and just taking Gosh as an example, is not because of the layers, but because the stuff, it is the White House. Because the stuff that's very particular, like the dining room apps, is also setting up the stuff that's continuous. It's not just the layers themselves. I mean, it is precisely a kind of coincidentia positorum. And that's the difference between literal and phenomenal. I mean, it's, in some ways, it's been overrated as a theme because it sounds so dramatic. And it sounds slightly Kantian. And of course, that was part of Cullen's background. I don't have a problem with it. I'm kind of amused by it. I think it can be overused, but I think I don't know of anything that's one meaning. One of the reasons I got to Punkt in space was because that's something that assigns itself the problem of being one meaning, and to find out that it could be a turd and that it was a prima materia seemed to be absolute poetic justice. And I think where the layers come through ontologically is in the modes of participation. And I think 99.62 of people who go to an outhouse go there and crap, basta, and they want to get out as quickly as possible. They might take something to read along with it or to cover up the hole. I think it's under special conditions that you start thinking, there's more to outhouse than just me going to take a crap. And that occurs to some people and not to others. You can see, if you Google image outhouse, which I did, just to see what would come up, there's all kinds of sort of entertaining little fantasies, including 2-story outhouses made out of brick and painted white with proper pediments and so on and so forth. So there's some kind of level of, outhouse can be more than just the hole in the ground. And when you go, obviously, to informal settlements, the way you deal with sewerage or defecation is almost an urban problem of decorum, because obviously it really victimizes women if all you can do is go out in a field, and so on and so forth. And I think those kinds, the capacity, in the Joyce, he obviously, he just wrote that kind of between, 1 and 3 in the morning in a little closet after teaching Berlitz English all day and going to the pub, laughing to himself. And, people have written about this as glossolalia, like it's some kind of, defect with words. That's the only way you could come up with it. But it does register. You don't get lost. Yeah, it takes a hell of a lot. You got 600 pages of that, and you say, right, I've got to grade my student exams or something. So I read little passages of it, and I happened to be working on the Corb when I spotted that one, so I got amused by it, and I realized it's useful in several ways. But I'm not averse to your idea that simultaneity is a kind of common motif, but I would qualify it in terms of the kinds of things that I'm talking about here as what we're talking about as simultaneity. It's not just a pile, it's not just, there's a real difference between a Schwitter's collage, which is mainly aesthetically oriented, and something like a collage by Gree or by Ernst. They have an objective quality. There's a kind of world there that you can move into. You aren't just, there's lots of beautiful things that Schwitter's does, but in terms of objective chance, he's much more on the side of chance than objective. Yeah.
I really liked your talk, but I got a little bit nervous when you started moving from Joyce to the institution. And at that moment, it sounded like you were privileging or making central dwelling. Because the way I take Joyce and that piece, he makes a litter of the letter. In other words, the letter becomes the turd, which in effect has very enjoyable effects, but also uncanny effects, Unheimlichkeit. And I say the unheimlich, it's going in the opposite direction where I saw the way your talk was going to make dwelling quite central.
I don't think unheimlich is, disorientation. It's a rereading of what is banal, basically. Fundamentally, our dreams deal with what is personal to us. What is personal about a dream is what we do with material that anybody can recognize. So that's about unheimlich. I think the motif of dwelling has to do with the incapacity to get outside being. I don't know why to try. It's a bit like architecture. You're always somewhere. Even in a wilderness, you're somewhere. You can name it. There's certain things you can do, certain things you can't do. It's only in kind of, CAD space where, you've just got an infinite plane that you say, where am I? And that's all I really meant by that. And to the extent that it's helpful, it indicates that there possibly are universals that grow out of differences. That there is ultimate, I could be from Papua New Guinea and you could be from New York. We may not be able to speak each other's language. You may not have a clue why I'm standing up or sitting, but we can communicate. This is, leveled. We can't, I'm not going to be reading Finnegan's Wake to you, or maybe I am. It'll sound like it automatically. But I think rather than assuming that everything is available to our reflection or our manipulation, the business of how to account for why we don't get disoriented, then more interesting, ambiguous the phenomena like Merleau-Ponty goes through and Dalibor goes through in his chapter 2. You take away gravity, you take away orientation. How do you regain sense? It's interesting that a child, starts out like this, basically able to sort of eat shit and make a noise. And it's only until the whole body is coordinated that they can begin using language. And it's part of that, deeper, more primordial level of orientation. And our capacity, I don't think it's helped by, you can describe it to death and you still won't get there. And I don't know if it's worth it. Rather, you go with it, you work with it. And I think that's what happens in practice is there's a style of, you can share it even with people who don't have your language and, get somewhere. And there's something going on about the phenomenon of orientation and how it provides the background for the capacity to use something as sophisticated as a language. I mean, the Joyce tends to be regarded as sophisticated. I think it's almost the opposite end. It's very concrete. It doesn't make it easier to read, but you reckon. I mean, as I say, it's like the journey to the loo and what the turd is animates all the other levels, and vice versa. I don't know if that helps.
One last question to Lawrence.
Well, it is more a comment than a question. Well, it is a question too, I guess. I really enjoyed what you said to us tonight, actually, and kind of the way you moved through Joyce to Corb and this kind of vision of being as something continually transforming, under transformation, and what the sense that I came away with was that you will simply, or the sort of world that you presented will simply never communicate with Graham Harman's world. I mean, it's a little bit like the difference between reading Joyce or the instruction manual for your new washing machine or something. It's two completely
Which is Graham?
Well, they don't match. You don't match. You and Graham don't match.
That's recorded now.
But,
right, great.
But it's two worlds that simply don't communicate. And I think, and this is the question now, I think we're left with a kind of moral problem, really, and that is which approach to the world will produce a better one. Whether are we, when we position ourselves in the world and we reason through, we try to make sense of our world so that we can move forward. Graham Harman produces a kind of a flat ontology that, although he does, as far as I understand him, try to find room for the fluidity of forms and the fluidity of ideas, it's basically very pinned down by this kind of, quadrature. The alternative that you presented, and there may be others, but just is this world that doesn't just remain fluid, but is kind of continually possible to rethink and rework because it is never fixed. And so I'm just wondering, and I don't think I'll ever talk to him, says we're not going to find a unifying theory which will allow real objects and the transformation.
I want to know about real qualities is what I want to know about.
Yeah, or real qualities. I don't understand really what real qualities are. But there's a movie, it's a romance, I forget what it is now, where the subway doors close and leaving the guy, the sailor, on one side of the doors and his one night only girlfriend on the other side with his hat. He says it was real. But anyway, I want to get back to what I was saying. I think we're presented with two completely different worldviews, basically. And the question is, we have then a choice. And it's an ethical one. It's like, which will lead to, which will allow me to do right in the world.
Yeah, I don't see myself as, I have a problem with worldview, taking Heidegger on worldview. I agree with that, and that's obviously one of my issues with respect to perspective. But I think because we've got to leave, and I can see the poor characters are going to shut us in here if we don't, I would just say one thing. I would probably distinguish between the actual and the real. And the actual is sort of what happens, and the real has some depth, has some orienting power, gives some meaning. And I don't know why we're happy to build the kind of towns that look like La Défense. And you know, this problem of resistance that grows up in architecture out of materials, out of metaphors of craft, even digital, manual, and all of this. Why it doesn't, as it were, scale up. But at the same time, everybody is now worried about where their orange juice comes from. So there's something happening. And I think in terms of big issues, you know, so long as we don't get wiped out by CPEs or by climate change, there's enough on the table that something will have to happen. It can't be like the scientists working on a bomb, just go talk to the politicians. You know, there is a common goal which we're, you know, responsible.
Okay, before I thank my... Let me just say a quick announcement for how we're going to wrap up this exchange, which is we've had 6 amazing talks, and we're all going to meet back here on June the 22nd when Graham Harman is going to come in and give us a talk on what he thinks objects mean for architecture. So come back in 3 weeks' time. Thanks.